All right, so let's just put this in terms of this is John Paul II, St. John Paul II. Before he was Pope, when Bishop, he wrote a book called Love and Responsibility. It's a dense philosophical work, but I think it's a fine treatment on the understanding of the human body and sexuality, right? So we will start out again to talk about the sexual urge and what it means to use, two different versions. Move on to utilitarianism and then how we interpret that sexual urge. So there was a video, it's off screen. Let me just click through it and then we will start. Here we go. John Paul II, he's going to have two different understandings of the word or phrase to use. The first meaning of the phrase to use is probably the one that we're most familiar with. It simply means to use someone as a means to an end. All right? So when we use something, we're literally using it as a means to a particular end. And that's necessary in a lot of relationships that we have. If you hire a plumber, or if you hire somebody to mow your grass, lay out the mulch, whatever. All right. But in terms of love and human sexuality, we'll see that it actually deteriorates the relationship. More on that in a second. Starting out with a fundamental understanding of the human person. All right. You have to remember what I talked to you about the Imago Dei. Two of the faculties of the soul, right? We have a rational faculty and we have free will. So Karol Wojtyła reminds us that man has the power of self-determination. But he points out that that self-determination is non-transferable. Okay? You cannot will something for somebody else. I cannot want something for you. You cannot want something for me. We could talk in terms of, I wish you happiness. All right? But we can ultimately not want that for you. It has to come from the individual. So as a father with daughters, I've learned very early that if they are dating somebody who, today we would use the word toxic, right? I see this is not good for her. I can't simply go and explain that to her, and then hopefully she'll see the light and no longer date this person, right? Because oftentimes these relationships start out on an emotional level, right, that you can't always appeal to. So the only way let me put it this way. As a father, I know that if I try to intervene between my daughter and her boyfriend, now I have no problem. I have one daughter that's unmarried, and I have no problem with her boyfriend, so I'm speaking hypothetically. If I were to say I wanted to intervene, it'd be like putting glue between them, because they would both resist that, and then my daughter, probably just out of obstinance, would even get closer to the individual. So my point is that a parent typically wishes they could will something for their children. They wish they could help them make decisions, but you can't. So that's a beautiful thing, though, in a sense that if we are self-determining, then we alone are the actors that choose our future. He also says that these powers are inalienable. And when he says inalienable, he means that they cannot be taken away. So the fact that you are choosing for yourself and nobody can choose for you, that can never be taken away from you. Not only that, and make sure you have this in your notes added, that neither is it proper to give it away. Okay? So if a young girl's in you're not married, you're in a relationship, and she's feeling pressured to show her affection physically with the young man, and she thinks that's part of the relationship, so therefore I voluntarily will submit, it's not even proper in that sense. Okay? Even though you might feel that you're still self-determined, it can't be taken away, but neither is it proper to give it away. Okay? It's very easy to say. Oh, go ahead.
So when you said you can't give it away,
it can't be taken away, and it's not proper to give it away.
It's not proper to give it away. Why is it
Well, what we'll talk about is that you never lose that, right? So in fact, what we're saying is it's never proper to be given away or taken away. So when you are with somebody, it's because it's a full self-determined choice. So in other words, which is really, in a sense, insightful. Remember I shared with you how people in marriages whose spouses cheated on them, even beyond being upset, beyond thinking that they were made fools of, they were hurt because they thought that they chose them. Okay, well, in marriage, that's what it is. It's a continual choice. So the person never gives up their self-determination for the other person. They are constantly choosing that person, right? So in that sense, it's never given away. It's something that's always a power of the individual, right? Which then leads perfectly, it's probably good you asked that, into this idea of gift. So the human person within marriage and love continually gifts themselves to the other person. Now this has to be total, right? Total and irrevocable. So you are seeking some common good outside that unites the man and the woman. All right? That's how that finishes. You're seeking some common good outside of the couple, but it unites the man and the woman. And it has to be total. All right? So the answer to how to have a quote unquote successful marriage is the simple answer, but a very hard one to carry out. Be absolutely, totally self-giving. So, in other words, think of, what dreams you have that lie ahead of you. Would you give those up for the other person? Whatever future you have. It could be anything from, I have the ideals to be this type of lawyer to I've always wanted to get a farmhouse and fix it up. Whatever it is, are you ready to set those aside for the other person? How total are you in? We'll talk more about that in a second right here. Well, actually, we can probably bring it up right again. So we have a capacity for love, right? The love of self-gift. But that means that we have to subordinate each of us to the good for the sake of the other, right? So whatever value and good you see in the other person, you have to be willing on any moment to subordinate whatever it is, your desires, for the good of that person. Now, that sounds very hypothetical. And nobody wakes up. My wife is absolutely self-giving. I don't want to go into our family story, but if I told you what her normal day is like and what her health is like, I think you would probably hardly believe me, right? I think that's her ability. So she doesn't wake up in the morning and say, in what ways can I sacrifice for my husband? But it just comes out. It just becomes part of her nature. And so too I try to do that. No, we're not ideal, okay? But picture two people doing that on a constant basis. And they're always willing to subordinate whatever other desires or dreams they have. That's not a couple that gets divorced. Again, and that's not our goal, it's simply not get divorced. We're trying to express love in a particular way. But if we have a divorce rate that hovers around 50%, even though that might change and differ according to various, dynamics, depending on, where you are, what education level, things aren't important for us to decipher right now. All I'm saying is that if you want to be that couple that's married 30 years and your son or daughter raises their glass and says, Mom, Dad, you set the standard too high, this is how you do it. But it's going to be exhausting. That's why I said if you're not called to marriage, if it's not a vocation you're called to, just don't do it. You'll really save a lot of people a lot of grief, okay? So the value that we see in the other person is that common good that both are striving for, all right? So we'll see another day how when you meet somebody, right, physically, emotionally, you're attracted, but there's something much deeper than even happens in the beginning, okay? None of us are just a picture. There's always more to us. We're animate, right? So the value of the person is that common good that both are striving towards. Now he says there's another meaning to the phrase to use. And he says the second meaning of the phrase to use is to enjoy, right? So we use things that we enjoy. We don't typically use things that bring us pain, all right? So we're setting ourselves up for a critique that he'll offer very shortly, and I'll have it on the next slide. But he says, here's the danger. If man's view in love is to isolate and seek pleasure, then that other person will be used as a means to an end, okay? And I'm going to explain more about this. If man's view is to isolate and seek pleasure, then that other person will be used as a means to an end. So before we started this today, I talked to you about that group down in Effort of the Cloister, right? Who kind of saw sex as something outside of their beliefs, something bad. The Catholic Church doesn't say that. It should be and is wholly pleasurable, right? So is eating. So I think the example that I used prior was if I go and have a cheesesteak, I mean, it's not just the fact that I'm trying to be nourished. I'm enjoying it. I'm using it, and I'm receiving pleasure from that. Okay, but my goal wasn't to enjoy and seek pleasure. I didn't wake up, and say, I want pleasure and enjoyment today. I think I'll go have a cheesesteak, right? I'm hungry, so there's something there that I'm satisfying, but while I'm eating it, it should be pleasurable. We could have had a world where sex and food were not pleasurable, where sex was simply something disturbing and avoidable, and food was simply tasted like wax. We would not have people that had eating issues, like myself, nor would we have anybody with sexual perversions. We would not be going eating cheesesteaks. We'd get cheesesteak tablets, and we'd eat the same nutrients, right? So pleasure is connected to these things that are necessary for the propagation of the species, food and sex, which makes it very easy for Satan to swing in there and pervert it. Because if it was something that was wholly outside of our desires and it was not pleasurable, why would Satan even have to get involved? But because it's pleasurable and because it's necessary, he can find a way to inhabit it and twist it around, all right? So if we isolate and seek pleasure, you're going to wind up abusing the other person. All right, that's the basic point there. And let me just say, if this has happened in anybody's life, any of this stuff, there's always redemption. All right? Making a mistake, you can't just say, oh, I made a mistake. I had an affair, I made a mistake. But you can overcome those things. All right? Love does have the ability to overcome these things. All right, so now John Paul II says, the problem with utilitarianism, and you have already studied that as an ethical system, we're trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. He says the issue with that is that if we say the useful is whatever gets pleasure, well, I guess we're speaking in terms of a utilitarian, right? We'll say the useful is whatever gives pleasure. It then becomes an essential ingredient of human happiness, all right? If you are looking at things and people in terms of their utility, then you are going to say that my pleasure is an ingredient in human happiness, and this is our world. This is a stark contrast between the Christian understanding of the world and the secular view of the world. If pleasure is your goal, then you will YOLO. You'll go for it all. You will get a huge bucket list, and you will fill that. I know, I'm really cool saying things like that. Yes, you can. Okay. But my point is, think back to what we said as far as an understanding of the human person, that we're supernaturally oriented. If you don't understand that we're supernaturally oriented, you will try to get all your pleasures in this world. Why shouldn't you? I've said it before. If for some reason my mind went blank and I decided there was no God, I'm going to be an atheist, I'm going to be a hedonist. I will seek as much pleasure as I can between now and death, and I'll do it at other people's expenses, because so what? That's really the only gauge I have for my happiness. All right? That's a secular view, not just of the human person, but also of happiness, and, well, let's just say based in pleasure. So for the utilitarian, to be happy is to live pleasurably. And how many people think this? When you hear people that are successful, or when you see celebrities, like sometimes you see them on the internet, these huge houses, and they have another place in France, and they go over. That's almost like it's titillating, isn't it? It's almost like that would be exciting to be like that. It's, just this continual pleasure. And, okay, if you have that amount of money, perhaps you can keep it up. But if you don't, you're going to be disappointed, because at some point, the well dries up. And you found out that pleasure really isn't something that was holding us together to begin with. And if you're a couple that's doing this, you're going to be buying stuff together. You're going to say, even like, we'll plan to have a child together. Maybe that'll help our struggling marriage. That's not going to work. Well, let's buy and fix up a new house. That'll be a project for us. Or let's focus on the kids. What happens when the kids hit 18? You're eventually going to find out that this was not a plan. It may have been a Band-Aid that got you across a certain amount of span of time, but it's not going to work, and it's certainly not going to be a measure of love. So the problem here is pleasure is essentially incidental. Okay, incidental means it's not essential to what's going on. And it is something that just occurs in the course of the action. Okay? Pleasure is something that simply occurs in the course of the action. I'm eating the cheesesteak, it's sustaining me, and I'm having pleasure while I'm doing it. But I didn't go after pleasure to have the cheesesteak. The same thing happens in conjugal love. All right? Even in the sexual act. Yes, that's an expression of the love between two people, and you will receive pleasure during it. But if you go after it simply for the sake of pleasure, then eventually you will be using the other person as a means to an end. Or you are at that moment, right? Now, this is even true, and this is the dangerous part. This is the thing you really need to understand for yourselves and also for the upcoming quiz. Utilitarianism could even be the harmonization of egos. When you seek pleasure, it's two people seeking pleasure alongside each other. And remember, yesterday I said, that gives the semblance of altruism. It seems like you're doing a good thing. You know, we're both in this together, we're both seeking this pleasure together, so therefore we're both being satisfied. It can even happen in, well, especially it happens in adulterous affairs. No couple having an affair do not at some point in a sexual act say how they love each other. But it's not the understanding of love that we're talking about. It can't be. All right? Because you've already promised yourself and chosen through a voluntary act somebody else. So this person that you're saying you love to, in a sense, is a lie. So when we talk in a day or two about how there's a language of the body, how the body can express the truth, the body can also express a lie. Right? Like I can mean yes and say no with my head. Like, are you going to give us all A's on the next test? Yeah, I'll give you all A's. Right? I can nod no and say yes, and then you're going to be confused because my body's not communicating what I'm speaking. It's the same way in a sexual act. All right? So a couple who's not married, they can say they love each other. It's based on emotion and sentiment. Really what you're doing is having the pleasure at the expense of another person. But it might be that two people think, but we're both having pleasure. So who loses here? Maybe the girl feels pressured to have a physical aspect of this relationship. And she feels, well, it's a way for me to express my love to him. He loves me. We're together. This is something I would do. So I'm voluntarily giving myself. So I'm giving myself, and we're both receiving pleasure. I'm sacrificing for him. Something I would want to do, but I'm sacrificing for him. You could put it into that type of language, and it has the semblance of altruism. But it's really not. And that's what makes it dangerous, okay? That it seems like it's a good thing. And we even use it in terms that it's a good thing. The problem is if one person ceases to experience pleasure, then the other person will become indifferent to your pleasure. All right? See, the harmonization of egos, that mutual egoism, it only works when both people are receiving pleasure. So if a couple's married and whatever they're doing, they bought a house together, we bought a boat together, we bought a jacuzzi together, that works as long as you both are having this ego trip next to each other. But the minute one person doesn't believe they're getting the level of pleasure they want out of it, they will get it at the other person's expense. So in sexual conjugal love, it's the same way. A person can say, well, but I'm receiving pleasure and she's receiving pleasure, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that that's never going to last. At one point, one person is going to perceive that their pleasure is no longer being satiated, so now they will become indifferent to yours. Because the utilitarian always tries to maximize pleasure. And if they can't maximize, and they will maximize the pleasure at the expense of another person. That's the total 180-degree opposite of the gift of the human person to the other, and subordinating your particular desires for the value in that person. Do you see? I mean, there's no like trick to a good marriage. This is not just comprehensive, but it's also very difficult. Not to know, but because of our wills to do. So John Paul II says, look, the personalistic norm, he says, don't forget, the only proper response to persons is love. So when you have two persons in a relationship, you can't use them. You use things, not people. The only proper response to persons is love. Now that sounds very simple, but it's profound if you think about it. He even then continues to say, everybody, every single person, has a rightful due to be treated as an object of love, not an object of use. So you can't, remember, you can't even properly give that away. You can't say, I'm okay with being used, because I'm getting something out of this too. You can't properly say that. You're almost diminishing your own humanity in front of that person. It's going to be a miserable existence, and it probably will, if it doesn't lead to divorce, will certainly lead to lifelong dissatisfaction. So we have to be treated as objects of love, not objects of use. Any questions on utilitarianism? Last slide, and we will finish this one, and then that'll be it. Now, how do we interpret this? Okay, he said, let's interpret this now. Now that we know what various tenses of the word to use means, not tenses, but his understandings of it, and we have some idea on what a utilitarian view of the human person is. He says, let's talk about the urgent instinct. And he says how they both come from the same Latin word. Now, Latin word for you to memorize is not important. It's just a way for me to tell you that the urgent instinct means the same thing, right? We don't often think that way. That's why it's important to point it out. Instinct sounds like something that comes biologically, and urge seems like, well, it's something that develops because of a desire. But in essence, they're really the same thing, at least how we're using them here, and how Karol Wojtyła understood it. But he says there's a problem. This urgent instinct is a very strong power within us. And because man is capable to decide for himself, right, we are self-determining, this urge always seems to be in conflict with our freedom. And that's true, right? Like if you're a diabetic, you have to watch what you eat. Your instinct is to eat what you want. And to watch what you eat always seems to be in conflict with your desires. So if a person has first of all, we all have these instincts, sexually, emotionally, psychologically, and to inhibit those seems like it's really pushing back our freedom. Why can't I express myself to him or her physically? That's my instinct, right? I'm falling in love, the emotions are flowing, I'm feeling what seems like love. It just seems natural to start being more passionate with him. And if I have to hold that back, it seems like my freedom is being limited. All right? So he's acknowledging, we understand that. And it's only because you're capable to decide for yourself. In other words, I don't mean to be crass or funny, but if two dogs were reproducing on the neighbor's lawn, you would never ask, why are they doing that? You wouldn't ask things like that. Because you know that what they're doing is instinctual. I mean, in other words, if you don't want them to do that, then you're going to have to spade or neuter the dog. It's the only way to handle it. You can't explain to the dog, I don't want you to mate, all right? But it's different with us, okay? And the reason why it's different with us is because we are capable of rising above our instincts. That is what separates us from the animal kingdom, all right? And remember I told you the fact that we have free will. What was the worldly understanding of it that opposed that imaging God? Just do what's instinctual. So if you have certain sexual inclinations, why shouldn't you carry them out? All right? If you have certain desires for your life, why shouldn't you do it? It seems quite natural. And to not do it seems unnatural. Well, he says man is capable of rising above his instincts. Or morality has no place in sexual ethics. In other words, if it was purely instinctual, we couldn't even talk about this on an ethical level. If human sexuality was purely instinctual, we would deal with it in the biology class and leave it at that. Now here's how you really know that this is true. You have a natural inclination for self-preservation. So if your family was in dire straits financially, and you had an opportunity to embezzle money, you embezzled money, and then you got caught, you would try to go and explain to the judge how I have a natural inclination for self-preservation and an opportunity to steal money. So I did. I had no choice in the matter. There's no way he'd let that one slide. He'd say, no, we understand you have a natural inclination for self-preservation, but unfortunately you're a human person who can choose for himself. You are self-determining. And we all understand that. We would laugh if that were the opposite. But in human sexuality, it's the same way. We're not animals. We could choose for ourselves. That puts it in the realm of morality and ethics. Now, this is not an argument towards the homosexual orientations, but it is a part of it. So it's worth mentioning now for a reason. Sexual attraction makes obvious the fact that the attributes of male and female are complementary. All right? We're talking about love and the aspects of gift. So what's that? No. So we're not reducing it down to a biological level. But regardless of where you particularly sit on the spectrum of homosexuality, orientation, and marriage, we all have to admit one thing. Only a male and a female can procreate. Two men cannot do it, two women can't do it. Okay? It's impossible in any which way. Now, hold on, we got to finish. Oh, you have to go on. So, he says then, the sexual urge that we have, right, to interpret it, it has a tendency to develop into love only because it's between two persons, right? And the only proper response between persons is love. So this is not between inanimate objects, like anybody who watches the TV series Taboo on the Nat Geo channel, where a lady married a Volkswagen Bug and another one married, say, a wall. Also, this is not just fantasy things like virtual sex, which is really going to be something your generation will be dealing with probably in the next 20 years. Because how will we deal with people who technically are not using the other person because it's a virtual person that you are experiencing, and that sex will be more satiating than real life sex, all right? I mean, there's already concerns and talks about such. Anyway, but it's between persons here. If it were just simply something biological, then you could use sex as a means to an end. If it were only biological, then we wouldn't be talking about it ethically. You could use it as a means to an end. Why? The same way that you might have a Labrador, but you don't like all the hair, so you breed it with a poodle, and you have a Labradoodle. If anybody knows that species, they're kind of a neat-looking dog, but they're also, they don't shed. All right? So you can use sex, in that sense, as a means to an end. Now, I'm going to put these two things up here, but they're important. Make sure you get what I want you out of this. I want you to have out of this. The personalistic norm that we talked about is bound up in the existence of respect for persons. All right? When we lay out the personalistic norm, it's bound up with the very existence of the respect of persons. These last 2 points are important. It cannot be used in the absence of love. If you use it in the absence of love, then you should be picking up somewhat on what we talked about under the module Sexual Revolution. Sex was separated from love. They even called it free love, which was ironic. It was neither free nor was it love. If you separate, if this exists in the absence of love, you have now separated sex from love. If it's found to be a nuisance or circumvented, in other words, the procreative aspect through contraception, even if we chemically sterilize ourselves, right? It's going to have a damaging effect on the love between persons. It will have a damaging effect on the love between persons. This last bullet point is where sexuality was separated from procreation. So here's where you separate sexuality from love, and here's where you separate sexuality from procreation, which is what has been the results of the sexual revolution that started back with Adam and Eve. All right? That becomes an issue. Yes?
So first one was sexuality and love, and the second one was sexuality and procreation.
Correct.